I'd like you to imagine that you live in a really repressive country. There are elections, but they're fake. The leader wins 100% of the vote each time. Security forces beat up opposition leaders with impunity, and they harass everyone else. This is a country where being in this room right now would get you on a list. Now let's say you've had enough, and so have many other people that you talk with in low whispers. Now, I'm not talking about the Hunger Games, although that would be awesome. Unfortunately, I'm talking about real-world conditions that many people face right now. So assuming you've decided to act, what would be the best way for you to challenge the system and create something new? My own answer to this question has changed over the past few years. In 2006, I was a PhD student here at CU Boulder studying political science, and my dissertation was on how and why people use violence to create political change in their countries. As for the scenario I just described, well, back then I bought into the idea that power flows from the barrel of a gun, and what I would have said was that although it was tragic, it was logical in such situations for people to use violence to seek their change. But then I was invited to an academic workshop put on by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. They were giving a week-long primer on nonviolent resistance to try to get people like me to teach about it in our classes. Now, my view of all of this at the time was that it was well-intentioned but dangerously naive. I mean, the readings they sent me in advance argued that the best way for people to seek really difficult political changes was through nonviolent or civil resistance. They described civil resistance as an active form of conflict where unarmed civilians would use tactics like protests, boycotts, demonstrations, and lots of other forms of mass non-cooperation to seek change. They brought up cases like Serbia, where a nonviolent revolution toppled Slobodan Milosevic, the butcher of the Balkans, in October of 2000, and the Philippines, where the People Power movement ousted Ferdinand Marcos in 1986. At the workshop, I said stuff like, well, those were probably exceptions. For every successful case you guys bring up, I can think of a failed case like Tiananmen Square. I can also think of plenty of cases where violence worked pretty well, like the Russian, French, and Algerian revolutions. Maybe nonviolent resistance works if you're seeking environmental reforms, gender rights, labor rights, but it can't work generally if you're trying to overthrow a dictator or become a new country. And it definitely can't work if the authoritarian leader you're facing is not incompetent, is somebody who's really brutal and ruthless. So by the end of the week, as you can imagine, I wasn't very popular. But my soon-to-be co-author, Maria Stephan, came up to me and said something like, if you're right, why don't you prove it? Are you curious enough to study this in a serious way empirically? Now, believe it or not, nobody had really done that before systematically. And although I was still skeptical, I was curious. I figured that if they were right and I was wrong, somebody better find out. So for the next 2 years, I collected data on all major nonviolent and violent campaigns for the overthrow of a government or territorial liberation since 1900. The data cover the entire world and consist of every known case where there were at least 1,000 observed participants. This is hundreds of cases. Then I analyzed the data, and the results blew me away. From 1900 to 2006, nonviolent campaigns worldwide were twice as likely to succeed outright as violent insurgencies. And there's more. This trend has been increasing over time, so that in the last 50 years, nonviolent campaigns are becoming increasingly successful and common, whereas violent insurgencies are becoming increasingly rare and unsuccessful.